On this exciting episode of the Perry Pod, things get so heavy that Perry needs a drink and invites Hamilton Burger to join him. It's Season 1, Episode 25 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Empty Tin. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple. Provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as time permits, I'll look at some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each episode I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia, as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler, where just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each week in the Law Library, we return to prior episodes to refresh our memories about Perry's past so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. This episode, I consider Lieutenant Arthur Tragg, no mere pushover for Mason, someone who not only does solid police work, but does so with wit and charm. There's more than one Tragg, to be sure. There's Serious Tragg, best exemplified here in the case of the moth-eaten mink.
Wasn't one cop enough, you miserable?
You all right, Tragg?
Yeah. Just sick to my stomach at the sight of him. You work hard at your job, you try to take some pride in what you're doing, and then a fink like this comes along and makes a rotten thing out of his badge.
Yeah, I better call an ambulance.
Yeah, call an ambulance. Don't hurry.
There's personally flustered Tragg, who we hear here in The Case of the Nervous Accomplice.
If instead of using paper wadding to hold the powder in the blank cartridge, you take some chalk, crimp just enough of it in the end of the shell to let the pressure build up, you'll burn up the powder and
the explosion will disintegrate the chalk so there's no trace of it. Oh, get me out of here before I use this.
Then there's Suave Tragg, best exemplified in The Case of the Baited Hook.
Well, Lieutenant, if we have to ride downtown together, would you be kind enough to give me your arm?
But perhaps my favorite is Witty Tragg, which we get to see in spades in this hilarious exchange from The Case of the Deadly Double.
I'm shocked, Mason. A fashion plate like you in the company of anyone improperly attired.
Oh, I see what you mean. Black bag, brown jacket. Well, some people just have no taste.
Of course. No private detective would be carrying an evening bag when dressed for the afternoon. Not even an ex-private detective.
In the novels, it's Tragg, not Burger, who is Perry's true opponent. In the episodes based on the novels, I believe that pattern holds. Now, let's get to the plot of this episode. The Case of the Empty Tin. An elderly wheelchair-bound Elston Carr seeks the daughter of his dead former partner. Carr was running guns in China when a partner betrayed Carr, who ended up crippled, while Carr's comrade, Adam Huxley, ended up dead.
John Lowell. Judas Lowell. He had Adam Huxley and me turned over to the Chinese communists. They trapped us in Peiping when the war broke out in Korea. Adam was killed. I was wounded.
Carr was saved by his Chinese companion, Gao Lung. And now Carr doesn't owe Huxley's daughter the money he made, but he feels a debt. Carr hates imposters, however, so anyone trying to pull one over on him is going to get prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Doris Huxley, a San Francisco woman beset by troubles, a dead husband, an institutionalized daughter, and one who never knew her father, agrees to go to Los Angeles and make her pitch to Carr at the encouragement of her mysterious new friend.
$2 million.
Huxley. An unusual name. How many women named Huxley? Your age? Do you think there are in San Francisco? Just one, Miss Huxley. Just one. You.
Doris finds that Carr's nephew, a playboy type named Alan Neal, doesn't care so much about the authenticity of the applicant to his uncle's advertisement, so much as he does getting his hands on some of the $2 million Elston Carr is offering.
Just as a matter of curiosity, how much would the dealer think his services were worth?
Half the pot?
Half of $2 million.
Well, without the dealer, your hand is worthless.
It's also apparent that Carr's way of proving the real daughter involves something he keeps in an office safe. Unsure what to do, Doris seeks Perry's help, and soon Perry is ingratiating himself with Carr. It turns out there's at least one other applicant named Miriam Huxley, who doesn't seem to care either way if she's the real daughter or not.
You know, I'm not just frantic to get my hands on this Huxley inheritance, but if I'm really entitled to it, I want it.
Well, you know what happens next. Perry gets a late-night call from Rebecca Gentry, Carr's secretary.
Hello, Miss Gentry.
Mr. Mason, what shall I do? I've got him trapped inside Mr. Carr's study.
Got who trapped?
I don't know. I just came home and I heard a shot. Came from inside the study. I locked the door on him, Mr. Mason. What shall I do now?
Carr is dead, and inside the room where his body is found is Doris Huxley and a safe that contains the titular empty tin. When the police show up, Doris is the obvious suspect, and Perry sums up the prosecution's case against her this way.
He'll maintain that you're a fraud, that you were coached and documented by John Lowell.
No.
That instead of Elston Carr calling you, you undertook to call on him. Carr was in his study. You shot him before you could make your escape. Rebecca Gentry returned from the theater, locked you in the library.
As Perry tracks down the mysterious man who pushed Doris to make a bid for Carr's money, he discovers that Doris's friend is none other than John Lowell, the Judas whose betrayal led to the death of Doris's father. Perry talks with Gao Lung about Lowell's betrayal and Lung's forgiveness, as it appears that Lowell has once again disappeared to wander the earth.
I think he has run away again. I think he will run away all the rest of his life.
Meanwhile, back at Doris's trial, it turns out that Alan Neal married Miriam Huxley, the other applicant.
Then where did you go during those 2 hours?
Miriam and I got married.
Where?
Right here in town. We got the license a week ago.
This shocks Rebecca Gentry, who Neal was swearing undying fealty to.
Ah, me, what did I do to deserve such popularity?
I often wonder.
Don't you worry, Becky. You're the only one I love.
Perry brings the prosecution's case to a grinding halt when he proves that Doris was the daughter Carr was looking for and demonstrates how the empty tin shows her authenticity.
I submit that the pieces of evidence in Elston Carr's safe were just this empty tin box in which the rightful heir's Bible would fit.
There's no rest outside court, however. Perry gets a late-night call from someone claiming to be Miriam Hoxley, now Neil.
I want you to know I killed him.
What are you talking about?
My husband, Alan Neal. He was no good. He was only using me. He murdered his uncle.
Now, you listen to me, Miriam.
Don't you understand? They killed his uncle. I don't want that girl to pay for something she didn't do. Now she can go free.
What have you done?
I told you, I killed him, and I loved him. And I'm going to kill myself.
Perry arrives in time with Trag in tow to save Miriam's life, and then gets Trag and Berger to go along with him to confront the real murderer.
I loved him. And he said he loved me. He said it. He said he loved me. But he was lying. He was lying all the time.
Rebecca Gentry's confession shakes the often combative Mason and Berger into commiseration.
Come on, Hamilton, I'll buy you a drink.
Yeah.
Now, let's compare the episode with the 1941 novel it was adapted from. Would it surprise you if I told you that A, there was no courtroom sequence in the novel, B, that Perry doesn't even have a client in the novel, and C, that the missing daughter of a deceased partner plotline is kind of an afterthought in the book? Don't be. That seems to be the rule more than the exception. I'm telling you, Earl Stanley Gardner came up with so many plot points for each of these novels that the teleplay writers were prospecting for gold, and the only issue was, what should they decide to keep and what should they throw away? The empty tin in the novel is not a means of proving who the daughter of Adam Huxley is, but rather a means by which characters share a code message with each other. The murder victims, neither of them are people who show up in the episode. One is a housekeeper, the other is a detective who is on the trail of Elston Carr, presumably for the Chinese, the Japanese, it's never really made sure. Elston Carr is an Oriental gun runner who was capitalizing on the conflict in China during World War II. In 1941, the year the novel came out, the war with Japan is a much bigger deal. Remember in the show that it's communist China that seems to be the real villain. In the novel, Carr hires Mason to help him find Huxley's daughter and manages to survive the novel, though he does sustain a bullet wound to the leg. Alan Neal, the nephew, well, he is sort of a playboy, and he does provide a fake Huxley daughter with the proof necessary to get Carr's cash. But in the novel, he actually has a motive, because in the novel, the inheritance money Carr has stands to go to him if it doesn't go to the daughter of Adam Huxley. Remember that in the show, the money Carr is going to give to Huxley's daughter will go to a foundation. So Neil's motive for manufacturing a fake applicant disappears. In the novel, Perry gets into some real shenanigans. He discovers both dead bodies, and then in one of my favorite scenes in the entire series thus far, lies to some cops in San Francisco that he's Lieutenant Arthur Tragg's brother, George, to avoid jail time as he tries to find the criminal. Remember, he doesn't really have a defendant who he's seeking to exonerate in this particular case. He's really just trying to save his own skin. And finally, the murderer is indeed Rebecca Gentry, who commits the crimes because she loved Alan Neal, but she's far from the broken woman we see in the TV episode. According to letters reviewed by Jim Davidson in his The Perry Mason book, Earl Stanley Gardner was really pleased with how Sealeg Lester, the teleplay author, adapted the episode from the novel. And apparently Lester did such a good job with the script and the others that he worked on that he was eventually made into a story editor for the entire show. Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. A Della is something about a particular character in the story. And a Perry is something we learn about our intrepid hero. Our Paul this week concerns Carr, Hoxley, and Lowell's actual business in the Orient. Carr describes their dealings this way.
We trafficked in guns, in ammunition, information. 100 times we saved each other's lives. We had it made, Mason. A fortune in U.S. banks.
I kind of want to know what the clandestine connection is between gun running and a fortune in U.S. banks. Maybe Carr et al. Were going to get in on that Texas bank syndicate that Ned Bain and J.J. Stanley profited from in the case of the Green-Eyed Sister. But here's my real research prompt for the episode. Is there any historical record of rogue Americans smuggling arms into China during World War II or at the beginning of the Communist Revolution in China? Did men like Carr actually exist? Our Della this week concerns Benson Fong, the actor who portrayed Gao Lung.
You do not expect an accent from me, Mr. Mason. Most people do.
Fong was a first-generation American born to Chinese immigrants in Sacramento, California in 1916. During World War II, he was hired by a Hollywood talent agent to start portraying a broad array of Eastern Asian characters, eventually landing a part as one of Charlie Chan's sons in a string of films. He appeared in 4 Perry Mason episodes. We'll see him next in The Case of the Caretaker's Cat in Season 2. And you might know him best as the white-haired Mr. Tang Wu in Disney's The Love Bug. Fong transitioned from acting into the restaurant business and started a small chain of Ah Fong restaurants that were still running in 1985 when he died from a stroke. Our Perry this episode concerns Perry's knowledge of Chinese. After a lengthy conversation with Gao Lung, one that reveals Mason's respect rather than prejudice for Lung, Mason says this.
Jai Jen, Gao Lung.
And that would be the word for goodbye in Mandarin Chinese. Nice work, Perry! What other languages do you know? Our theme for this episode is motivation. The episode ends with a laugh as Paul cracks wise about the motive for Gentry's murders.
What some women will do for a man is just plain murder.
We also hear Elston Carr talk about why people do the evil things they do.
I understand human nature. I know what people do to each other when there's a dollar concerned.
But perhaps the most philosophical take on human motivation comes from Gao Lung, who talks at length to Perry about humanity's historical relationship to violence.
Mr. Mason, once I saw an epitaph, a phrase on stone, that this man who for many a year found death in life may here find life in death. I think John Lowell should have that on his stone when he dies.
Then he is alive.
I came here to kill him, Mr. Mason. A man is a complex thing. He misinterprets so many things in life because of his viewpoint. Himself, his ego, his selfishness. Well, it is 50,000 years fighting out of a cave against 5,000 in society.
Lung thought money motivated John Lowell's betrayal. In fact, Lowell betrayed his partners to save his life. And Lung dismisses his own pursuit of revenge because this sounds great in theory, but it's a faulty explanation for the murders we see on the show Perry Mason. Lung says we pretend to be urban civilized people, but we can't simply slough off the genetically ingrained memory of primitive violence we've been conditioned for. After all, we allegedly spent 10 times longer in the caves than we have in the justice-hungry cities. Lung incorrectly exchanges the effects of murder for its cause. He believes that because things were brutal back before man was civilized, we have a satisfactory explanation about why supposedly civilized people still betray one another out of self-interest. Lung has taken a moral fact, transmuted it into biology, and then tried to use it as a kind of moral clemency. Now, don't get me wrong, Lung should forgive Lowell. It's the means by which Lung acts out that forgiveness that seems a bit problematic to me. Lowell couldn't help it, Lung seems to say. It was kill or be killed, and Lowell's genetic predisposition kicked in. In an effort to rationalize his own forgiveness of Lowell, Gao Lung makes crime ultimately irrational. It's what you do when you stop thinking. We're not responsible because we don't control our own consciousness.
Panic. No thinking, no breathing, just blood in my head. They were going to kill me slowly.
Perry silently nods and approves Gao Lung's words, but then he gladly hands Rebecca over to the authorities. Maybe not gladly. He begrudgingly hands Rebecca over to the authorities, let's say. He's essentially, Perry, a proponent of natural law. He trusts in reason and in the inherent existence of right and wrong. Now, occasionally, he will drift towards pragmatism. We've talked about that when he senses that his duty to his client supersedes his duty to do the right thing, because there's really nothing essentially spiritual to Mason's approach. But it's tough to tell what the motives are for a uniform code of justice if you begin with the idea that we're all kill or be killed at our cores. I'm telling you, Perry's continual victories in these cases tends to obscure how bleak the setup of the show can be. Now, it's time for a Perry proverb. Perry's precise with his language. When Hamilton Berger tries to slip in a prejudicial word against Doris Huxley, Perry is prepared.
On April 5th, did a pretender...
I object.
...to the district attorney's choice of words.
Really, Mr. Mason? I used the word pretender in its classic sense, as in pretender to the throne.
Well, since this hearing is not being conducted under a monarchy, may I suggest a choice of words perhaps a little more on the contemporary side, just to eliminate misunderstanding?
This is 20th century America, and when you come against Perry armed with the word's denotation but not its connotation, you had best step back. Now let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
You know, there is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Thanks to everyone who gave me feedback on my last episode. At Marge Helsper's suggestion, I'll use this space each week to try and answer the research prompt I presented in the last episode. Our Paul last episode concerned the legal status of people with personalities. My question was, what does the state of California have to say about that thorny legal issue now? The best report I was able to find was a 1998 news article for the Los Angeles Times reporting about a man who had committed brutal crimes who was pleading insanity because he had multiple personality disorder. While it appears that California still had the same laws in 1998 as it did in 1958, when the case of Helen Reed and Joyce Martell reached the courts, the issue has become more of a vexed one. The article quotes a USC law professor who uncovered in research that from the years 1991 to 1996, nationwide, about 40 criminal cases have involved defendants who have claimed insanity due to their multiple personalities. This is in comparison to a grand total of 20 cases in the entire country dating back to the first days of the American judicial system. The problem with putting those who plead insane in state hospitals, one solution, is that for anything short of a life term, a inpatient can apply for outpatient status within 6 months, and after a year of outpatient status is eligible to go free. Since the determining factor is typically whether or not the controlling personality in the person shows volition to commit murder, it seems like Joyce Martell could have been found guilty had she pulled the trigger, but wow, that was a great deal more complicated than I had anticipated. I received a first-time email from Helen Hurd, who let me know that in addition to this show, she listens to the 1950s Perry Mason radio serials, which are available via iTunes and Spotify. The serials precede the TV show in terms of chronology, so they had stopped making them by the time CBS started making the television show in 1956, and they represent a gap in my Perry knowledge, but Helen's email has inspired me to fill that gap post-haste. Helen writes, quote, I'm a huge Perry Mason fan, as is my mom. She's been fighting cancer and a bad infection for the last 4 years, and TV has been a distraction. We watch Perry together on MeTV when we can. I also get mailed them to her by Netflix. I found the 1980 movies on YouTube, and we watched the one you covered a few months ago. Just wanted to say thank you. Thank you so much for writing, Helen, and we will be praying for your mother's recovery and encouragement. I was also happy to hear this from my brother Elisha, who wrote in with a series of interesting questions. He wondered, do we ever get a sense of Perry's rise to courtroom fame? Was there a time when his theatrics weren't so well known? Is there a prequel or some explanation as to how Paul Drake came to be in the financial thrall of Mason? And he wonders if it's something that the new HBO show will blunder into. Funny you ask, Elisha. That's exactly what the HBO limited series Perry Mason is going to blunder into. A new series starring Matthew Rhys from The Americans is set for a future release date. Nobody knows when at this point. Is set in 1932 Los Angeles and focuses on the origin story of famed defense lawyer Perry Mason. When the series starts, Mason is not a lawyer, but a low-rent private investigator who, during the Great Depression in Los Angeles, investigates a kidnapping gone wrong. Paul Drake is a cop, not a private investigator, so it's sort of like the Batman Begins of Perry Mason, I guess. This is most definitely going to divide fans. I believe there are fans who are ready for an updating to the series, or at least a more modern take on the series, a post-1950s take. But there are already a lot of derisive comments online if you do some searching among the real Perry fans out there. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this week's pod that you'd like to comment on or something that you'd like to correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com or email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. All Perry Pod episodes are available via Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Next time, we learn about Perry's World War II past and get acquainted with the intricacies of photography. It's the case of the half-wakened wife. Join me, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat!